Hello and welcome to the MECERN podcast. This is the podcast where we talk to MECERN members and associates about their recent or ongoing research into the medieval world of Central Europe. I'm Karen Culver, and today it's my great pleasure to be meeting with Karen Stark to talk about her research onto places, patronage and piety, the cult of the Virgin Mary in late medieval Hungary. Karen is an interdisciplinary historian who completed her PhD at CEU in 2022 on the cult of the Virgin Mary in medieval Hungary. Her main research focus is the cult of saints, pilgrimage, religious material culture, and the concept of sacred space. She has worked as an archaeologist in the United States, Albania, and Hungary, and engaged in museum and historical work in the United States and Europe. Karen currently works at the Centre for Folk Life and Cultural Heritage of the Smithsonian Institution, where she is working with living history and culture bearers, for which I admit I am rather envious. In her spare time, Karen plays Celtic music on a 34-string lever harp and on occasions has been known to go busking with her harp. Karen, welcome to the MECERN podcast.
Oh, thank you so much, Karen. It's wonderful to be here.
It's good to have you here. Nice to meet you. Today we're going to talk about the cult of Mary, Saint Mary the Virgin, and you refer to Marian placemaking. Please, just to start us off, what do you mean by placemaking and where were these places?
Sure. Yeah, placemaking is a big buzzword these days, as well as sacred space. Um, I became interested in placemaking because my background is as an archaeologist. So I was always big into the place material culture aspect of that. And when I transferred into becoming a historian, I wanted to look into how we can combine historical research with material culture spaces, things like landscape. Placemaking itself is a term developed in urban planning. So it's started maybe in the 90s, 2000s, and it kind of took off from there into the social sciences. Um, when it comes to sacred space, there's in the medieval world, maybe in the 2000s is when it became popular, with people like Andre Vaucher, who was looking at sanctuaries, and Andrew Spicer and Sarah Hamilton in England, looking at sacred space in different contexts. And for me, placemaking is a reciprocal process of people and place and how they influence each other through social processes, through identity, and how that interconnects. When I was applying it to my thesis, I wanted to have a more regimented view of how I could look at placemaking. So I adapted a method developed by Asimone Leitzer-Lasar. She was looking at placemaking in the context of Roman religious sites. And I found that she had a very good structured method of looking at the different elements that go into a place and how it develops over time. So if I looked at, I think, 5 or 6 factors. Number one, place, which by that I mean the topographical location, the monastery, the city, what exactly it is, what is the physical characteristics. Actors, the people engaged in the place, objects, the material culture related to it, and 4 practices, which are rituals, donations, those kinds of things. 5, intellectual entities. Seems strange, but it could be concepts like, for example, with Mary, the Immaculate Conception, which was developed in the later Middle Ages, and there might be a place dedicated to the Immaculate Conception, or certain ideas were carried out in certain places to a greater or lesser degree. And finally, time, by which I mean the actual progression of time and how it affects a place. But it could also be things like feast days or legends associated with a place or the kind of authority that time gives. So if you say something is ancient, it gives it more authority versus something brand new. And for me, these are a lot of different elements that I try to interweave, kind of like a tapestry, to see how a place has developed over time, how the people there are affected by these processes, how they affect the place, and that reciprocal nature of things. So in Hungary, the places I was looking at were very varied. Ecclesiastical institutions, churches, parish churches, cathedrals, monasteries and nunneries, even palaces that have royal chapels in them, sites of coronation, and especially pilgrimage sites was a big focus.
Yes, but why Mary? Why not Christ? Why not a local saint or a saint specific to Hungary? Why Mary?
Good question. Yeah. Uh, we could say Mary was the most important saint of the period, more or less, after Christ. Um, so why Mary? For me, it kind of developed in my research naturally. In my master's programs, I did a master's at CEU and also one in England. I was very interested in natural places like springs, mountains, and things like that are associated with saints and holy in some way. And as I was doing that research, I found that, particularly in Hungary, these sites were associated with Mary, even more than in other regions. And I was kind of looking into why that was, what was so special about Mary that she was associated with these sites. And as I looked into it more, I saw how important she was in the Hungarian medieval period. And there was really this special relationship there. And I wanted to pick it apart and see why that was. Because she is so universally thought of as the most important saint, but there was something special here. And just because something is important doesn't mean it doesn't have meaning in a specific context. So that's what I was really trying to investigate.
So, who were the other saints in the league table? And was it the same throughout Europe?
Yeah, it actually varies quite a lot. I thought that when I was looking into patricinia data, so the churches that were dedicated to a certain saint or idea, that I would find that Mary would universally be the most important, most popular saint. But that was not the case. I actually found that for cathedrals in the Holy Roman Empire, for example, she was the third most often chosen as patron. In Scandinavia, she was not the most popular. In Bohemia, neither. During the Middle Ages, I should say. It might have changed later. Um, so it wasn't a universal thing that she was most widely chosen. A lot of times, people would pick a local saint that was more closely tied to the community. So, for example, in Hungary, at the same time that King Stephen, his son Emmerich, were canonized in Hungary, you also had these local hermit saints, Saint Benedict and Andrew Zerard, who became very important in what is now Slovakia, in Nitra. Um, and so that became very important for local identity to have this person you could look to as from your community. Other saints also that would be on the League of Mary, it may have surpassed her in some communities, would be Saints Peter and Paul. Obviously, with the Holy Roman Catholic Church, Saint Peter was the origin of their authority. So you see Saint Peter becoming very incredibly important. Um, so yeah, Saints Peter and Paul, the apostles. Sometimes local saints are more important. And I should also point out royal saints like Saint Stephen, who was the first Christian king of Hungary, his son Emmerich, and then later another Hungarian Saint King Ladislaus, also were incredibly important. So while Mary was important, she was not, there were other people in the same league or almost in the same league as her.
So, the cult of Mary was an important part of medieval Hungary. And you say in your thesis and book proposal that was part of the everyday life and community building of the people.
Mhm.
And you mention as part of this community building the concept of inclusion and exclusion in relation to the Marian culture. Please, can you explain what you mean?
Sure. One of the interesting things about Mary is that she was such a malleable saint. She could be a lot of different things to different people. So she was a paragon of female virtue. She's a mother, a wife. Um, Nuns could look to her for a holy life. And she also could reflect what a community wanted to uphold as virtuous. So, regarding inclusion, especially in the late medieval period, you have confraternities established around Mary that become important centers of the community. They come together to do funerals, prayers, they make donations to the confraternity in the name of Mary. They do processions through the town with their insignia, showing that we are the Marian confraternity. And there's a very deliberate order of people in the procession, and only certain people or certain parts of the community could become part of this confraternity. So, in that way, you're creating a community centered around a figure. And exclusion, talk about these other way that people viewed malleable Mary, in that she's like a warrior for the Christian faith, especially in the sense of enemies of the Christian faith. So Mary was often used as kind of a foil against Jewish communities, people they viewed as heretics and eventually Ottomans in the later Middle Ages. Especially in Hungary, something I explored in my thesis is the whole idea of taking synagogues and converting them to Marian churches and kind of using Mary as this antithesis to the Jewishness. So in the period in the late Middle Ages, especially in Bohemia and southern German lands, there was this phenomenon of taking synagogues and converting them into typically Marian churches, sometimes to Corpus Christi churches or another saint, but predominantly Mary. And there are a couple of different reasons we think this happened. One is that there was a kind of anti-Semitic rhetoric inherent in some manifestations of Marian devotion. So we know, like during the later Middle Ages, there were accusations of blood libel against Jewish communities and host desecration and things like that. And in those accusations, there was often associated with Mary that she saved somebody or she came and stopped the desecration from happening, things like that. And the reason for that is just complicated. There's several ideas. One is there is this concept of ecclesia versus synagoga, these different concepts and also artistic manifestations of the church versus the synagogue. A lot of times Mary became identified with ecclesia versus the synagogue. So these are the competing things here. So it's an interesting phenomenon, and it's strange that we find this mostly in southern German lands and Bohemia, and that it reached Hungary. And this is something that was first talked about by Andras Weig and Bernat Kumarowicz, who saw it first happening in Buda during the time of King Sigismund. So it's an interesting phenomenon.
You say that Mary could be represented in a very malleable way. So there are many different communities that could adopt and be adopted by the Marian culture. And yet my memory of the Bible is that she is hardly mentioned at all. Her actions are not mentioned. She had a child.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty much it. How did the medieval people manage to find rationale for creating such a persona?
Yeah, there are apocryphal books and other books related to the Bible that are not part of the Protestant Bible of today that Mary takes a larger role. So they pulled a lot from that. There was a lot of oral culture about Mary that promoted her. And I think that part of the reason that Mary became so big, part of the reason why she's still popular, if you see missionaries going into like South America, Mexico, for example, um, they promoted Mary quite a bit because a lot of people had this kind of female deity or female mother figure that they identified with. And they took that and molded it into Mary, and it was very appealing. The idea of a comforting mother figure in your church where there's fire and brimstone and hell is very comforting it to people. And I think that it just caught on quickly because of that. And it was almost natural that it came to such prominence. And there's also part of it is the theological issues that arose within Christianity, uh, like with the Immaculate Conception of Mary. Um, Before I started was a medievalist, I didn't realize Immaculate Conception was about Mary's Immaculate Conception. I thought it was about Christ's Immaculate Conception. Uh, there were questions about how can she give birth to a perfect son if she was born into sin. So these huge theological discussions come out of that, and it becomes part of the zeitgeist. And you eventually get to the point where, like, well, she had to have been born out of Immaculate Conception too. So she's a pretty important person if she was immaculate conceived, and she's also chosen by God to bear Jesus. So I think, yeah, she became popular for a lot of those reasons.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Particularly for me, particularly the echoes of pagan cultures where they worship the female and fertility, and adopting, merging that into a Marian culture. Yeah, I can see the sense of that. You mentioned a few minutes ago about the patrons of the Marian culture, and I'd like to follow up on this a bit. These patrons would invest their time and their finances to create a Marian shrine or artifact, a place. What do you think they gained specifically from Mary that they wouldn't have gained from other saints?
Yes. So why did people become patrons of Marian spaces in particular? Um, when it comes to the royal sphere, I can give you a couple examples from the Angevin dynasty. So the Angevin period is a really interesting period in Hungary when I think about donors, because it was the time when a new dynasty came into Hungary. The last Arpadian king had died. There was this big struggle to see who the new king would be, and Charles was crowned King of Hungary. However, he had an uphill battle because he was seen as kind of a foreigner, being from Naples, although he had Hungarian connections and ancestry. So part of his method of integrating into the Hungarian devotional landscape and legitimizing his authority was to use this already established connection between Hungarian royal authority and Mary. So he very famously founded a lot of places dedicated to Mary. His son very famously carried it on even further. So, for example, in Mariazell in Austria, it's a pilgrimage site dedicated to Mary that supposedly has a miraculous image of the Virgin. Uh, Louis made such grand donations, basically redid the whole church and dedicated some additional images and riches to the place that he's considered kind of the second founder of Mariazell. And it seems odd. Why would this Hungarian king want to donate this money and goods to a random pilgrimage church in the mountains of Austria? We find actually that there was a lot of connections between the Habsburgs, who were also a huge dynasty at the time, to this site, and they were very important in the period. Louis had a lot of interactions with them, wanted to develop that connection. So that might have been part of why he wanted to make some donations there, get on their good side. There's also a legend about Louis that after fighting the Ottomans, he prayed to Mary of Mariazell in particular to help him in the battle. And she did, and that's why he made these donations and everything. That's a legend that comes later, probably not exactly based in truth, but it does show the connection between Louis and Stephen the first Christian king of Hungary, who prayed to Mary to save him during a battle against the Germans and then also against the pagans. So they're drawing these connections between Louis and royal power, Mary, and also at the same time ingratiating themselves to their neighbors and the local dynasty. So that's one example of a king doing that.
In your thesis, you mentioned three royal sites in Hungary linked to the Marian culture, these being Oradea, Székesfehérvár, and Buda. I know Sekesfehérvár and Buda were royal sites, but also there was Esztergom, which is the third royal site of Hungary. What happened with Esztergom? Why was that not also dedicated to Mary?
Great question. Yes, the connection between Mary and the royalty of Hungary starts way back in the beginning when, according to the legend of Saint Stephen, on his deathbed, he dedicated the kingdom to her. That legend came around 1083 when he was canonized. We do know that Stephen did dedicate a lot of places to Mary. He did seem to have some kind of personal devotion to her. But this time period is when Hungarian royal authority was having some struggles with the papacy. And the papacy, in letters to Hungary, wrote how King Stephen of old dedicated the country to St. Peter. So you should also dedicate yourself to St. Peter. And there's a long history of the papacy using this kind of rhetoric of a kingdom being dedicated to St. Peter. Um, so the theory is that this legend asserts that no, we're not under St. Peter. We have independence, and Stephen specifically dedicated the kingdom to Mary. So we are independent kingdom, independent Christian kingdom, and we can pick our own bishops, stuff like that. And this is something that gets emphasized again and again, that Hungary derives its authority from Mary.
I'm interested in what you said that the Pope requested the dedications should be for St. Peter, and the monarch saying, no, it was Mary. Was this an indication of a papal Hungarian tension? Obviously not a conflict, but a level of tension?
Yes, it's part of an ongoing back and forth of political power, certain people vying for the throne in Hungary who have papal support, others who have the support maybe of the King of German lands, the Holy Roman Emperor. And it's something you see in other kingdoms as well. So, for example, in Polish lands, in Moravia, there's also letters and writings about them being under the patronage of St. Peter. So this is kind of a rhetorical device that the papacy used to try to say, like, hey, you're part of us. Your religious authority comes from us. And the Marian dedications and other kind of reinforcements of that are countering that at the same time.
Hmm. I think these days we might call that reciprocal tariff, don't we?
And back in that time too, you had the pension of St. Peter. So you did have to, yeah, your tax to Rome.
My God, I love medieval history.
I know. It's great.
um, you mentioned earlier that King Stephen I of Hungary, on his deathbed in 1038, left the kingdom to the Virgin Mary. I would have thought that a king would leave the kingdom to a named successor, typically his oldest son. So how did people view the idea of leaving the country to the Virgin, and what did it imply about Stephen's view of his successor and his kingdom?
Mhm. I think that he didn't think of it in the sense of I'm forgoing my succession line. However, his son did die young. So there was this question about who is going to rule. And we see later that it's actually kings who maybe have the taint of being foreign, using this imagery and this rhetoric to show that they are the right heir. So, for example, Bela III had donated the Porta Speciosa. He had spent most of his life in Byzantium, and he kind of had this taint on him that he was not meant to rule Hungary, that he's not the rightful heir. But you see him making this image, the Porta Speciosa, saying, here, I'm connected to this line. He's also the first Hungarian king who puts Mary on his coinage. So he was really trying to assert his right to the throne. Again, when the Angevins come in with Charles and Louis, They're also asserting their Hungarianness by attaching themselves to this image of Mary. Um, and then later, Matthias Corvinus also capitalizes on it. But it's always during these transition periods that you see the most evidence. That's where I see it coming up in the question of legitimacy and authority the most often.
In May 2024, MECERN published a podcast with Maria Varga, who is mapping sites of religious places in Hungary. She has suggested from this mapping that religious sites were created in a very top-down manner because of their locations, thus indicating they were placed by some probably royal authority. Religious sites weren't created through the enthusiasm of the local people in a bottom-up manner. Does the Marian culture that you're looking up link up with this suggestion? And do you see any similarities between your work and that of Maria Varga?
Certainly. Yeah, I've worked with Maria Varga in the past. I love her work. I think she's excellent. And I actually worked with her on a book about the Christianization of the early kingdom of Hungary. In that sense, 100% it follows that top-down authority. We actually find that in the early 2 centuries of the Hungarian kingdom, that in these county seats, these seats of power, you find churches within the castle structure or just outside of it dedicated to Mary. It's pretty consistent. It was first developed by Patronage, was the one who came up with the theory. And I've looked a lot into this concept. He also says that there was commonly a parish church dedicated to St. Michael. I haven't found so much this relationship to St. Michael, but this connection to the Virgin Mary and seats of power is pretty evident, and archaeological evidence supports this. They're built at the same time as the churches. Sometimes they're castle chapels that develop into collegiate churches or to other kind of royal churches. And we could conjecture that they are a imitation of the kings and their dedications, that they're also saying, we have a Marian place too. Look at us, we're like the king in these county seats of power. I also was trying to explore if there's any bottom-up evidence for the Marian devotion, but it's really hard to detect. When you find things in the historical record, it's usually about nobles and royalty. People make donations who have money, obviously. Uh, in terms of material culture, we can find evidence of rosaries and things like that in last wills. But even then, it's still people who had the money to make a last will and buy these things. There is evidence of cheaper kinds of rosaries in the local people would have made out of bone or wood. We do find that throughout the Hungarian kingdom in graves pretty early on, but it's hard to make any conjecture about popular forms of Marian devotion and how that affected a place just based on that kind of sparse evidence, unfortunately.
But yes, presumably once the sanctuary of Marian location was established, then it would have gained some local popularity?
Certainly, yes. And we find especially that places where there's a lot of different ethnic communities, there were often Marian churches because there's this universal appeal everyone could gravitate towards, which is kind of interesting. And then on the reverse of that, we have places, especially where there are German settlers, they also made churches dedicated to Mary as kind of this universal saint that they could all congregate around, which is interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting. It's a good point. That is interesting. Coming from England, which is part of old Europe, old Christianity, I guess, I wonder if there's the same, this top-down religious conversion with a required saint, or is it part of the later conversion of New Europe, Central Europe?
Yeah, I would be interested in exploring that too, because in other regions where they're kind of new in new Christian kingdoms, a lot of times there wasn't this Marian focus. It was more on the local saints or their national saint that they kind of congregated around.
Yes, that would make some sense, to have your national saint linking it to nation building, to state building, as Poland has with St. Adalbert and St. Stanislaus. Yeah, that makes some sense.
Yes, yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Karen, you were an archaeologist before becoming a historian, so I assume, therefore, you have a natural interest in the material culture and obviously locations. Is there a strong material culture related to the cult of the Virgin Mary in Hungary?
Yes, there's some really interesting manifestations actually of Marian material culture in Hungary. I can think of an example are these circular or annular brooches that we find in Hungary. They're circular brooches that have engravings on the side. It might just say Mary. It might say variations of the Ave Maria prayer. Sometimes they have different decorations on them. And you find them throughout Europe, especially places where the Hanseatic League was. There's this whole circulation of these kinds of brooches, especially the ones with Marian imagery or text on them. But in Hungary, they were found predominantly between the Tisza and Danube River at the graves of women, um, and women who probably were Cuman, coming from the steppes. Um, there was an influx of these communities during the High Middle Ages in Hungary. And it's odd that we find these brooches specifically in that region. There's a couple of theories why. One is that the Franciscans, who were really big into proselytizing to these new communities, were using the brooches as like a gift, as a way of bringing them into the community. Um, but it's strange. It's a weird phenomenon that I haven't found other places where specifically this became an emblem for them. Maybe they didn't even know there was a connection to Mary and just liked it from a style point of view. So it's a really strange phenomenon. We also found that they were probably forged in Eastern Hungary by German communities. So they're not created from Hanseatic League area where it was thought that they all originated from, but actually were developed in Hungary itself and then spread to these women. There's one other example of such a brooch found in modern Croatia, which would have been part of medieval Hungary at the time. And that one is a little bit different and thought to have come from France or from Western Europe. So you see these economic lines of goods coming through with different ideas, different materials. We also find other things like pots and other pieces of jewelry with the Ave Maria on it. But these are mostly found in ecclesiastical spaces and probably came from a royal household or from the top people within a monastery. But it is interesting and something I'd like to look at further.
And the Cuman community coming from the steppe and moving into Hungary, do you think the brooches were mass produced, highly popular, and relatively cheap? Or do you think they were only for the middle classes or upper classes?
They definitely weren't cheap, that's for sure. They could have become like a status symbol. It might have originally been like a gift from a Christian group to this group to say like, hey, become part of our community. And then the higher people in that community kind of wore it as a status symbol rather than an expression of Marian devotion. We're not sure. But they could have been made with lesser or more quality. So you do get ones that are of really nice metals, some that are cheap metals. The same as with rosaries. You can have them made out of bone, but also made out of coral or precious stones and things like that. So there was a wide swath of variety.
And you mentioned pottery as well?
Yes, yeah, we find not that much evidence, but some interesting evidence of pottery with the Ave Maria around the edges. There's also stove tiles with Marian imagery on them, predominantly in the late medieval period in Hungary, which are quite beautiful and have imagery from the late medieval period. But interestingly, Mary is not the most popular image found on religious stove tiles. It's actually St. George and the dragon. My guess is they wanted something kind of interesting and fun on the stove tile, which St. George and the dragon is pretty fun. So I think there was that aspect of it.
um,
Yeah.
I guess if you've got a stove tile, you've got a wealthy place, and that
Certainly.
could
Mm.
have been a monastery.
Definitely, 100%. There were actually most of the Marian religious stove tiles were found in monasteries and nunneries and things like that. In regular people's homes, it wasn't as popular.
Popular or affordable.
Both. Even people like nobles, they were less likely to have Mary on their religious stove tiles, more likely to have St. George or another saint. But yeah, regular people, there's no way you're having that nice of a stove.
Hmm. I'm involved in archaeology with a castle in northern Hungary. The stove tiles we find are either from the wealthy parts of the castle or unused in the storeroom. You always get an extra square metre of tiles in case one breaks.
Oh yeah, I have some tiles in my garage right now for if I had to
Mhm.
redo some tiles. Yeah.
Me too.
Yeah.
um, Karen, for my final question, as I am aware of the time, the cult of the Virgin Mary was very strong in the Middle Ages, but you are still looking at it, and there is a lot of modern work going on in this cult. Why is the cult and the veneration of Mary still interesting and still relevant today?
Yes, I think that it is incredibly important today, especially in the political, cultural world we are in right now. Um, Viktor Orban, who's the Prime Minister of Hungary, when he was giving a speech in Spain several years ago, brought up this whole legend about Saint Stephen and that the kingdom was dedicated to her. And there's a growing emphasis in far right circles on the religious history of European nations. And it's so important to look at these histories critically and how it actually developed and formed and not just use as political talking points. We find it more and more in the past, 20 years or so. I think it's really important to look at these with a critical eye and not just let politicians use things willy-nilly. Also, in my work with the Smithsonian, I've worked with a lot of people in America and South America who are creators of religious material culture. They make Marian icons and altars, and it's still very relevant for them today and important in their communities. And it's so refreshing as a historian to meet these people and talk to them and see how this is still a very active part of their lives that is evolving all the time. And to see how history has continued to evolve and be important for people's identity and cultural heritage.
Yes, that is a good point. And it's nice to see that there are some areas where the Marian culture and veneration is still important and relevant and not just part of a political propaganda tool.
Yeah, certainly, certainly. And looking forward to doing more work on it in the future and especially looking at manifestations of Marian veneration today and how it has changed, how it's affected by our shared historical past, and what it means to people today.
Karen, thank you very much. It's been good to meet you. And thank you for coming in and talking to MECERN. It's been extremely interesting.
Oh, thank you so much. It's wonderful to talk to you, Karen.
Thank you. Today I've been talking with Karen Stark about places of patronage and piety, the cult of the Virgin Mary in medieval Hungary. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you found it as interesting and enjoyable as I did. I certainly did. Please do look out for the next MECERN podcast, in which MECERN members and associates talk about their recent or current research into medieval Central Europe. And if you have research that you or your colleagues are doing, and you would like to talk about it to MECERN, please do contact me through the MECERN board or MECERN website administrator. In the meantime, I'm Karen Culver for the MECERN podcast. Thank you and goodbye.